Welcome to the Age of Imperialism. So after you've set your imperialism notes up, I'm going to walk us through some information. So please jot these down. Know that you can pause this presentation at any time. So the Age of Imperialism starts in the late 1700s and moves all the way into the 20th century up to World War I. And imperialism is defined as the domination by one country of a political, economic, and or cultural life of another country or region. Countries or regions controlled by another region are called colonies. Imperialism can also be called colonialism, or another country dominating another country is called colonization. So this is essentially when one country, in this case, it's mostly European nations, take over other nations because they're stronger. They're more dominant politically, militarily, economically, and they take over the whole life of that other nation. In this time period, this growth of imperialism by Europeans into places like Africa and Asia is spurred by an industrial revolution. Motives for that imperialism, you can remember those motives by looking at the word empire. E-M-P-I-R-E helps us remember the motives that Europeans had to engage in this imperialism. The first is economic motives, military motives or militarism, political motives, ideological motives based on ideas, religious motives, primarily Christianity, and exploratory motives, wanting to map the entire globe. So I'm going to go through each of those individually. So economic motives, as Europeans are industrializing, they're shifting from what we call a cottage factory or a cottage industry system where individuals apprentice and make from beginning to end entire products to corporations and factories making those products. So when we industrialize, we're looking for raw materials for those manufactured goods, but we're also looking for places to sell those. So like markets. The M in empire is militarism. There is this belief or desire that governments should maintain a strong military power and use it aggressively to defend national borders and interests, and also promote those national interests. You have political power struggles. Germany is competing with Belgium, who is competing with France, and they're all competing with England and Spain and ultimately the United States for world domination, basically. And that political struggle evolves in a competition for these colonies around the globe. You have ideological reasons or motives. The root of the word ideological is ideo, which is the same as idea. So Europeans had these ideas that they were going to bring things like industrial progress and democracy to these other nations. You have religious motivations, this desire to spread Christianity and the Christian faith. And it goes with a view that anybody else is considered maybe a heathen if they practice other forms of religion, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, even Islam. There's also exploratory reasons. People wanted to map the entire world and have the sort of glory of saying that they were the first to get to someplace like the North Pole or the source of the Congo River. And you could bring glory back to your nation and be heralded as a hero of your nation if you were able to do this. So there was this major race to explore the world and map it and plant your flag in it, so to speak. So when we talk about militarism, this is also fueled by this industrial revolution. European nations begin this military buildup, and that causes a huge competition between those European nations. They start industrializing their armies, including industrial weapons of war and technology. And this also includes creation of larger, faster ships, destroyers, battleships, gunships, etc. And they were with steam engines, and they could motor across the oceans far more quickly than sail ships. And they could surround a port very quickly and bring troops and invade a territory very quickly. And so there was this big, intense competition among nations to build up these large navies at this time. England had one of the largest navies in the 1800s, and the United States very quickly followed suit as well. So one of the phrases you hear is the sun never set on the British Empire. So I want you to take a look at this graphic. Will it play for me? And see if you could figure out why the sun never sets on the British Empire. Notice the dates in the upper left-hand corner. During its peak, the British Empire literally had territory in every single line of latitude, or longitude rather, in the world. So the sun literally never set. In 1870, this is what the African continent looked like in terms of territories that had been conquered by European and Middle Eastern, because you have the Ottomans in there, peoples. And at this point, you can see it's primarily the coastlines where people have dominated, but that's partly because of the geography of Africa itself. It's difficult to get into the interior of Africa, and it is so large. But by 1884, here is another map you can see. You have the entire continent has been carved up and is being controlled by about 8 primarily European nations. So European nations were competing with each other, and they started to look around and see that, oh gosh, other people are getting ahead of us, other nations. So in order to prevent wars, Europeans met in Berlin in 1884 and divided up the map of Africa. They created rules for dividing Africa and agreed that any nation could claim land by notifying other nations of their claims and showing that they could control an area. So they needed to maintain a military base, a pretty strong military base there. And you'll notice Africans don't really have any land for themselves anymore. They've all been thrown into this map and are under someone else's control. The same thing was happening in Asia. The primary dominant force in Asia was Great Britain and France, but you can see the Netherlands, Russia, Portugal are all also involved, as well as the United States. India was the jewel in the British crown, so to speak. In the 1750s, the British East India Company took over large parts of India and actually ruled it until 1858. The company had its own army, which was led by British Army officers and staffed by Indian soldiers who were called sepoys. While Britain was ruling India, Indians were forced to produce raw materials and goods to be shipped to Great Britain, but they were also forced into exclusive trade agreements where they could only buy British goods. Now, if you remember anything about the American Revolution, those sorts of agreements that American colonists were forced into caused us to actually revolt and was one of the causes of the American Revolution. When we talk about ideology, one of the things that is a driver for this age of imperialism is this idea of social Darwinism. You'll also hear it called the white man's burden. This is the idea that Europeans had that spreading civilization and democratic ideals around the globe was their evolutionary duty. Many people perceived and took Darwin's ideas and applied them and said, we are far more as Europeans evolved than other nations. It's a pretty racist view of the world. And these Europeans often treated these conquered territories much like you would treat children. Because of this, nations did not actually allow those new colonies to practice democracy. They often forced their language, culture, and religion on those colonies because they viewed them as children. It was this idea that Europeans were going to bring, quote, civilization to these territories in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So this social Darwinism had a kind of race factor behind it. Charles Darwin's ideas about survival of the fittest were sort of square peg being shoved into a round hole. People were saying his idea of the fittest could also be seen through wealth and power that white Europeans seemed to have. And so they considered themselves superior to others, especially non-Europeans. They were considered to be lower on the scale of cultural and physical development. People went so far as to even do things like measure people's skulls to see if they could prove this theory, though it was never proved. And it was this idea that it was the duty of Europeans to bring progress to these, quote, lower races. And again, this became known as the white man's burden. Rudyard Kipling, who was a pretty famous author and was raised in colonial Britain, primarily in India, and he was a white European raised in India, wrote a poem called The White Man's Burden, where he talks about these ideas of how it's white society's role to bring the rest of the world up to a civilized place. Interestingly enough, Rudyard Kipling also wrote The Jungle Book, a much loved children's book. So you would see these late 19th century charts that would show racial stages of evolution from apes to Europeans. And this is a progression from A to F on this image that is actually extremely unscientific and inaccurate. This social Darwinism will lead us to a eugenics movement in the early 20th century. Eugenics has been around for a long time and goes all the way back to ancient Greece and Plato, and it's a set of beliefs and practices that aim to improve the genetic quality of the human population by excluding people in groups judged to be inferior and promoting those that they believe to be superior. So in a historical context, Adolf Hitler was raised during this time in Europe. So you can see that this idea of eugenics was not new to Adolf Hitler and this idea of creating a superior race when we get to the Holocaust. It's just one of the many contributing factors for what will be the Holocaust when we get to that part in this unit. But you can see that this idea of eugenics likely influenced Adolf Hitler and many other people like him who stood by and let 6 million people be killed in the 1930s and 40s. All right, that's all for now. We'll learn more later. Bye.